some of the international conventions and organizations. The first organization over here is United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, that is UNCED. Now, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development is also known as the Rio Summit. It was held in Rio and is also known as Earth Summit. It was held in 1992. Now, the issues addressed in this conference were production of toxic compounds, alternative sources of energy to replace the use of fossil fuel, new reliance on public transportation system in order to reduce vehicle emissions, and the growing scarcity of water. Now, the 1992 Earth Summit had 4 outcomes. The first one is UNFCCC, and it has 2 major branches, that is Kyoto Protocol and Copenhagen Accords. Then there was the United Nations Convention to combat desertification. For biodiversity, we had the creation of CBD, that is Convention on Biodiversity. And for that, we have 3 legs, which are Cartagena Biosafety Protocols, Nagoya Genetic Resource Protocols, and Aichi Targets. For sustainable developments, we have Agenda 21, Forest Principles, and Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. Now let's look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, that is CBD, and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They were 2 legally binding of this agreement, that is CBD and UNFCCC were 2 legally binding agreements that were reached upon during the Earth Summit itself. Now, Agenda 21 is a non-binding action plan for United Nations related to sustainable development. The number 21 signifies the agenda for 21st century. Since 2015, Sustainable Development Goals are included in Agenda 2030. Now let's look at Forest Principles. It is a non-legally binding authoritative statement of principles for a global consensus on management, conservation, development of all types of forest. It makes several recommendations for conservation and sustainable development of forestry. Now let's move on to UNFCCC. Now it was, as we saw, that it was in the Earth Summit that it was conceived, and it is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As a follow-up, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, that is Rio Plus 10, was held in 2002 in Johannesburg, South Africa. In 2012, the United Conference on Sustainable Development, that is Rio Plus 20, was held in Rio and is commonly known as Rio Earth Summit 2012. The UNFCCC provides a framework for negotiation of specific international treaties, which are called protocols, that aim to set binding limits on the emissions of greenhouse gases. As of March 2019, UNFCCC has 197 parties. Now let's move on to Convention on Biological Diversity. Now CBD is an internationally legally binding convention which recognized for the first time the need for conservation of biological diversity for the welfare of mankind. The agreement covers all ecosystem species as well as genetic resources. Now the objectives of the convention include conservation, sustainable use, and sharing of the benefits in a fair and equitable manner. In the 10th meeting of Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity held in Nagoya, Aichi biodiversity targets were adopted for the period of 2011 and 20. Now, there are 20 targets, which are awareness of biodiversity increased, biodiversity values integrated, incentives reformed, sustainable production and consumption, habitat loss halved or reduced, sustainable management of aquatic living sources, sustainable agriculture, aquaculture and forestry, pollution reduced, invasive alien species prevented and controlled, ecosystems vulnerable to climate change, protected areas, reducing risk of extinction, safeguarding genetic diversity, ecosystem services, ecosystem restoration and resilience, access and sharing benefits from genetic resources, biodiversity strategies and action plan, traditional knowledge, sharing information and knowledge, mobilizing resources from all sources. Now the year 2020 is referred to as super year for biodiversity because the strategic plan for which the 20 global IG targets were adopted in 2010 ends in 2020. And now all countries together are in the process of preparation for the post-2020 Global Diversity Framework. Now, COP11 to the CBD was held in Hyderabad, India. The most important outcome of the COP was commitment of the parties to double the international finance flow for biodiversity by 2015. India instituted, together with UNDP, Biodiversity Governance Award at the COP. Now let's look at the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. CBD covers rapidly expanding field of biotechnology through its Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. It addresses technology development, transfer, benefit sharing, and biosafety issues. Now, for the biosafety protocols, it seeks to protect biological diversity from potential risks posed by living modified organisms, that is LMO. The two main sets of procedure under the protocol are Advanced Information Agreement and LMO intended for direct use as food or feed or for processing, that is LMO FFP and AIA. Now, under AIA, the LMO for which intentional release into the environment is intended must notify in writing the party of import before the first processed export takes place. Now, for LMO FFP, risk assessment reports should be publicly available through Biosafety Clearinghouse. Now, Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Safety Supplementary Protocols on Liability and Redress reinforces the Cartagena Protocol. The supplementary protocol specifies responses which must be taken in case of damage to biodiversity resulting from living modified organisms. Now, Nagoya Protocol is a 2010 supplementary agreement to the 1992 Convention on CBD. The Nagoya Protocol is about access to genetic resources and fair and equitable sharing of benefits. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem, that is IPEPS, is an independent intergovernmental organization established by the member states in 2012. The objective of IPEPS is to strengthen the science policy interface for biodiversity ecosystem services for conservation, sustainable use, and long-term human well-being and sustainable development. Now, UNCCD, that is United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, was established in 1994. UNCCD is the sole legally binding international agreement which links environment and development to sustainable land management. Now, it is one of the Rio Convention that focuses on desertification, land degradation, and droughts in regions like Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean. Now, desertification is a type of land degradation in which the biological productivity of the land is lost due to natural process or induced by human activities, whereby fertility becomes increasingly arid. Now, UNCCD launched land degradation neutrality to conserve, sustainably manage, and restore land. 14th COP of UNCCD was held in New Delhi and adopted New Delhi declarations. Some of the initiatives were International Coalition for Action on Sand and Dust Storms, that is SSD, Initiative of Sustainability and Stability and Security, that is 3S, and Youth Caucus on Desertification and Land. Now let's move on to Ramsar Convention. Now, Ramsar Convention is an intergovernmental treaty that provides framework for national action and international cooperation for conservation through ecosystem approach and simultaneous sustainable use of wetlands and their resources. However, it is to be noted that under Ramsar Convention, there is no binding provisions related to the conservation of wetlands. It was adopted in the Iranian city of Ramsar in 1971, but it came in force in 1975. Now, it is the only global environmental treaty dealing with a particular ecosystem, that is wetlands. Ramsar is, however, not affiliated with United Nations. Now, parties to the Ramsar Convention commit to working together to the wise use of wetlands, identify suitable wetlands to be listed under wetlands of international importance, that is the Ramsar list, and ensure their effective management. Now, international cooperation on transboundary wetlands is also one of the objectives that the Ramsar Convention commit to. Montrexu record is maintained as a part of Ramsar list. It is a list of wetlands of international importance where changes in the ecological character have occurred or are occurring or are likely to occur as a result of human interface. Now, Lake Loktak Lake in Manipur and Kelia National Park in Rajasthan are two Montrix record sites in India. Now, Ramsar Convention partners are Wetland International, Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, World Wildlife Fund for Nature, International Water Management Institute, IUCN, and BirdLife International. Now let's move on to the Changwon Declaration on Human Well-being and Wetland highlights positive action for ensuring human well-being and security in future. Now let's move on to the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species. It is also known as Bonn Convention and it aims to conserve terrestrial, aquatic and avian migratory species throughout their range. Now it is an intergovernmental treaty concluded under the aegis of UNEP, concerned with the conservation of wildlife and habitat on a global scale. Now CMS is the only global convention specializing in the conservation of migratory species, their habitats and migration routes. Now let's look on the appendices of CMS. The first appendix relates to migratory species threatened with extinction. The second appendix of the convention relates to migratory species that need or would significantly benefit for international cooperation. Now, Indian government signed the Raptor MOU on conservation of migratory birds of prey in Africa and Eurasia with CMS. However, the MOU is not legally binding. Coalition Against Wildlife Trafficking, that is CAWT, is a unique voluntary public-private coalition of like-minded governments and organizations sharing a common purpose, that is focusing public as well as political attention and resources on ending the illegal trade in wildlife and wildlife products. Now the 13th COP to the Convention of Conservation of Migratory Species of Wildlife was concluded in Gandhinagar. India hosted the CMS COP for the first time. Now CMS COP 13 adopted Gandhinagar Declaration, which calls for migratory species and the concept of ecological connectivity. Now the theme of CMS COP 13 was Migratory Species Connect the Planet and We Welcome Them Home. Mascot was Jibby, the Great Indian Bustard. Now let's move on to the Convention on International Trades in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Fauna, that is CITES. Now CITES is an international agreement between governments entered into force into 1975 and became the only treaty to ensure the international trade in plants and animals does not threaten their survival in the wild. It is a legally binding agreement. Now CITES is administered through UNEP and a secretariat is located in Geneva. Now there are three appendices to CITES. The first appendix mentions all the highly endangered species which are threatened with extinction. Appendix 2 mentions those species that may become threatened, that may become endangered. That is, species not necessarily threatened with extinction, but in which trade must be controlled in order to avoid utilizations incompatible with this survival. Now Appendix 3 deals with those species that are protected by at least one country. Now let's move on to the Vienna Convention. The Vienna Convention was adopted in the year 1985 and it entered into force in 1988. It acts as the framework for international effort to protect the ozone layer. Now the Vienna Convention for Protection of Ozone Layer and its Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layers are dedicated to the protection of Earth's ozone layer. It has 197 parties and is the first and only global environmental treaty to achieve universal ratification. Now, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change established an ozone sale and steering committee on the Montreal Protocol to facilitate implementation of the Indian country program for phasing out of ODS, that is ozone depleting substances, by 2010. Now Kigali Amendment to the Protocol is a legally binding agreement under which parties are expected to reduce and the use of manufacture of HFCs, that is hydrofluorocarbons, by roughly 80 to 85% from their respective baselines till 2045. HFCs, though a greenhouse gas, is not dealt with under the Paris Agreement, but under Montreal Protocol. Kigali Agreement for HFC reduction is legally binding on countries from 2019. However, developed and developing countries have different targets regarding their reductions in the use of HFCs. Now let's move on to Minamata Convention. The Minamata Convention on Mercury is a global treaty to protect human health and the environment from adverse effects of mercury and its compound. It was agreed in the fifth session of Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee in Geneva and entered into force in August 2017. Now, controlling the anthropogenic release of mercury throughout its life cycle is one of the key obligations under the convention. The convention also addresses interim storage of mercury and its disposal once it becomes a waste. Sites contaminated with mercury as well as health issues. Now, more than 140 countries, including India, have ratified the convention. Let's move on to Rotterdam Convention. It was adopted in September 1998 and came into force in 2004. The convention is jointly administered by UNEP and FAO, and it creates legally binding obligations for implementation of prior informed consent. Now, the objectives is to promote shared responsibility and cooperative efforts among the parties in international trades of certain hazardous chemicals. Now, they also want to contribute to environmentally sound use of these hazardous chemicals by facilitating information exchange about their characteristics. The convention covers pesticides, industrial chemicals that have been banned or severely restricted for health or environmental reasons by the parties, and which have been notified by the parties for inclusion in Annex 3 for the purpose of PIC procedures. Recently, two chemicals, that is pesticide phorate and the industrial chemical hexabromocyclodecadane, were added to the Annex 3 of the convention, making them subject to PIC procedures. However, which countries can decide, however, through which countries can decide on future imports of these chemicals. Now, Basel Convention deals with the transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal, and was adopted in 1989 and came into force in 1992. The objective of the convention is to protect human health, environment against the adverse effects of hazardous substances. In the scope and application covers wide range of wastes defined as hazardous waste based on their origin, composition, and their characteristics, as well as two types of waste defined as other waste, household waste, and incinerator ash are also included. The guiding principles of the convention are transboundary movement of hazardous waste should be reduced to a minimum, minimized at the source, managed in an environmentally sound manner, treated and disposed of as close as possible to their source of generation. Now, the regulatory system is the cornerstone of the Basel Convention based on the concept of prior informed consent. Now, it also has a provision of written consent. Now, the waste covered by the Basel Conventions are lead batteries, persistent organic pollutants, polychlorinated biphenyls, chemical waste generated by industries, biomedical waste, and oils, that is used oils. The Basel Ban Amendments prohibits all export of hazardous waste, including electronic waste and obsolete ships, from 29th wealthiest countries of OECDs to non-OECDs countries. India is yet to ratify the ban. During the Conference of Party to Basel Convention, that is COP14, following decisions were taken. Adoption of an amendment to include unsorted, mixed and contaminated plastic waste under PIC. Establishment of a partnership on plastic waste to encourage member countries to manage plastic waste in an environmentally sound manner. Now, provision for an adoption of technical guidelines on transboundary movement of e-waste and used electrical and electronic equipments. Now, let's move on to Stockholm Convention. Stockholm Convention deals with persistent organic pollutants. Now, for a chemical to be defined as POP, it should remain intact in the environment for a long period of time, become widely distributed geographically, and should accumulate in fatty tissues of human and animals and have harmful impact on human health or environment. It calls for international action on three categories of POPs, that is pesticides, industrial chemicals, and unintentionally produced POPs. Now, POPs under Annex A of the convention are to be eliminated. Under Annex B, the chemicals are to be restricted. Unintentionally produced POPs under Annex C of the convention has to be restricted or eliminated. Now, the convention requires parties to prevent the development of new POPs and promote the best available techniques, that is BAT, and best environmental practices, that is BEP, for replacing the existing POPs. Now, the convention initially addressed 12 POPs known as the Dirty Dozen, but now 30 chemicals of global concern are listed under it. Now, during the conference of parties to the Stockholm Convention, that is COP9, it was decided to list diclofloc Dicofloc, dicofol, dicofol, and perfluorooctanoic acid, that is PFOA, used in production of non-stick cookwares. It salts PFOA related compounds under Annex A of the convention. Now let's move on to some international organizations. Traffic is a wildlife trade monitoring network established in 1976 by World Wildlife Fund and IUCN. It was established principally as a response to the entry into force during the previous year of CITES. Now, Traffic serves as an international network consisting of Traffic International, based in Cambridge, with offices in 5 continents. Now, Traffic undertakes its activities in close collaboration with government and sites. Now, International Tropical Timber Organization is an organization under the UN, and it is promoting the conservation and sustainable management, use, and trade of tropical forest resources. Its members represent about 80% of the world's tropical forest and 90% of the global tropical timber trade. The United Nations Forum on Forest was established by Economic and Social Council of United Nations, that is ECOSOC, with the objective of promoting the management, conservation, and sustainable development of all types of forest to strengthen long-term political commitments to this end. UNFF was based on the outcome of Intergovernmental Forum of Forest, established by ECOSOC in 1997. The forum has universal membership and comprises all the member states of United Nations. Now, IUCN was founded in 1947 as International Union for Protection of Nature. The organization changed its name to IUCN in 1956 with headquarters in Gland, Switzerland. A just world that values and conserves nature is the vision of IUCN. Its members include both states and non-state, non-government organizations. Now, Global Tiger Forum is an intergovernmental organization and international body working exclusively for the conservation of tigers in the wild. Tiger Forum. Now, GTF is an intergovernmental organization and international body working exclusively for the conservation of tigers in the wild. Now, 5 subspecies of tigers are considered over here. Now, GTF was formed in 1994 with its secretariat at New Delhi. It is the only intergovernmental and international body campaigning to save tigers worldwide. Now, the General Assembly of the GTF meets once in every 3 years. Now, let's move on to International Whaling Commission. Now, International Whaling Commission is the global intergovernmental body which works towards the conservation of whales and management of whales. Now, IWC's headquarters are located in Cambridge and India is a member. It was established under the International Convention of Regulation of Whaling signed in Washington, D.C. in 1946. Now, the Commission introduced zero catch limits for commercial whaling in 1986. Japan recently pulled out of IWC. Now, let's look at other global initiatives. Now, IPCC is a United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. It was established in 1988 by UNEP and WMO. Now, India is a member of IPCC. Now, instead of IPCC itself does not conduct any research or does its monitor climate related data or parameters. Instead, thousands of scientists from all over the world contribute to the work of IPCC on a voluntary basis. Now, IPCC has so far published 6 assessment reports, the latest being released for 2021 and 2022. IPCC also publishes special reports like IPCC Special Report on Global Warming on 1.5 degrees Celsius. For its outstanding work, it has also received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Now, IPCC established the National Greenhouse Gas Inventories Program to provide methods for estimating national inventories of greenhouse gases emissions and for the removal of the same from atmosphere. The guidance produced by NGGIP is used by countries that are party to the UNFCCC to estimate the emissions and removal that they report to UNFCCC. Now, the Petersburg Climate Dialogue series was launched in 2010 following the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference and has been hosted annually by Germany. The dialogue facilitates open discussions in small groups on key issues in international climate policy. Now, the 9th Petersburg Climate Dialogue was held virtually for the first time in wake of COVID-19. It was co-chaired by Germany and UK. Now, 30 countries including India attended the dialogue. Now, let's look at Climate Action Summit, which was convened in New York. The theme was Climate Action Summit 2019, a race we can win, a race we must win, by the UN Secretary General. The focus of the summit was to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement by raising our ambitions. The countries were asked to prepare realistic plans to enhance their nationally determined contributions by 2020 to achieve net zero emissions by 2030. Now, the 3% Club was formed in the summit, which is a coalition of countries, businesses, and international organizations that have committed to achieve a 3% global increase in energy efficiency each year. Now, India is a member of this club. Now, C40 World Mayors Summit was held in Copenhagen, Denmark. Now, C40 is a network of world's megacities that was started in 2005, and cities from India like Delhi, Chennai, Jaipur are also part of this network. Now, let's look at Climate Vulnerability Forum. It is an international partnership of countries highly vulnerable to a warming climate. The forum also serves as a South-South cooperation platform for participating governments to deal with global climate change. Now, let's look at Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It is an international coalition of countries, UN agencies, multilateral development banks, private sector, and academic institutions to promote research and knowledge sharing in the field of disaster resilience infrastructure. Now, CDRI was launched by the Indian Prime Minister at the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit held in September 2019. Now, South Asia Cooperative Environment Program is an international organization established in 1982, headquartered at Colombo. Its member countries include Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Maldives, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Now, SACP aims to promote and support protection, management, and enhancement of environment in the region. SACEP also serves as the secretariat of the South Asian Seas Program, which comes under the purview of UNEP Regional Seas Program. During the Conference of Parties, that is COP15, held in December 2019 in the Copenhagen, developed countries pledged to provide new and additional resources, including forestry and investments approaching $30 billion for the period of 2010 and 2012, and with balanced allocations between mitigation and adaptations. This collective commitment has come to be known as Fast Start Finance. Now, let's look at REDD, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. It is a global endeavor to create incentive for developing countries to protect, better manage, and save their forests, thus contributing to the global fight against climate change. Now, 3 UN agencies, that is UNEP, UNDP, and FAO, have collaborated in the establishment of UN REDD program. Now, REDD Plus goes beyond merely checking deforestation and forest degradation and includes incentives for positive elements of conservation, sustainable management, and forest, and enhancement of forest carbon stock. REDD Plus incentivizes developing countries to keep their forests conserved by offering result-based payments for actions to reduce and remove forest carbon emissions. Thus, it can play a big role in protection of biodiversity, strengthening the resilience of forest ecosystem and reducing poverty. Now, let's look at globally important agriculture heritage systems, that is GIAHS. The FAO recognizes GIAHS as remarkable land use system and landscape which are rich in globally significant biological diversity evolving from the co-adaptation of a community with its environment and its need and aspiration for sustainable development. India has two GIAHS as recognized by FAO, that is Traditional Agriculture System Koraput, Odisha, and Below Sea Farming System in Kutanad, Kerala. Very important. Now let's look at some pointers for prelims. Now 1 trillion tree initiative, that is 1t.org, is an initiative by World Economic Forum led by UNEP and FAO, and it was launched to ensure the conservation and restoration of 1 trillion trees within this decade. Now the United Nations General Assembly declared United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, that is 2021 to 2030, with an aim to massively scale up the restoration and degraded and destroyed ecosystems in order to fight climate crisis and enhance food security, water supply and biodiversity. Now Tropical Forest Alliance was launched in Rio 20 Plus as a global public-private partnership with the aim of halving deforestation by 2020 and ending it by 2030 in the tropical rainforest countries. The secretariat of the alliance is hosted by WEF. Now let's look at Global Carbon Project, which was established in 2001. It is a global research project of Future Earth, a research partner of the World Climate Research Programme. It seeks to quantify greenhouse gas emissions and their causes. Now recently New Zealand passed the Zero Carbon Law, which seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Likewise, European Union launched Green Deal, which aims to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and increasing emissions reductions by 2030 to at least 50%. Now UNFCCC Secretariat launched Momentum for Change, that is climate neutral now, an initiative aimed at encouraging and supporting all levels of society to take climate action to achieve a climate neutral world by mid-century as enshrined in the Paris Agreement.